The memories we carry can define us, sometimes to the very end. For Mike Starr, it was the moment he recounted being with Layne Staley, hearing his friend beg him not to call for an ambulance. He left and carried that memory with him like a life sentence. Mike was once a shining star of Alice in Chains, helping to create the albums Facelift and Dirt. But the public doesn't remember him for his bass notes. They remember him as the last person to see Layne alive. That label haunted him for 9 years, turning every public appearance into a confession. In 2011, Mike Starr was found dead in a house in Salt Lake City. The report was concise: drug intoxication, a lonely end, far from home, when he was just 44 years old. The remaining question is, did Mike pass away with a truth no one would acknowledge? Or did he simply carry the weight of a guilt he had self-imposed? Let's explore and find out the truth behind. Chapter 1. A boy with a dream, fueled by liquor. At 11 years old, he washed dishes at an IHOP, his shirt reeking of grease, just to trade for an old bass guitar. At 13, under the dim lights of an Atlantic City bar, a bartender poured him a drink as if he was already 18. From there, 2 tracks began to run parallel: music and alcohol, and they weren't always heading in the same direction. At that age, most kids asked their parents for toys. Mike folded up every tip, tucking it into a shoebox under his bed. His first bass buzzed and rattled, but it opened a door he believed was his only way out. In an old yearbook, there's a faded inscription that reads, "Gonna tour with Van Halen." No one knows what year it was written, only that it was something he talked about constantly. Childhood friends said Mike only had one topic of conversation, and his eyes would light up when Van Halen was mentioned. In Atlantic City, someone held on to an undated receipt with a hasty signature. The bartender at the time didn't check for age. Maybe it was a mistake, or maybe it was intentional. Either way, for a boy not yet 14, the bar became another kind of classroom, one no one should attend too early. The wooden bass, with paint peeling off its sides and a slightly loose E string, felt different. Each time he touched it, Seattle seemed a little less gray. In that small room, the heavy bass filled the emptiness left by his broken family. Seattle wasn't much brighter back then. It was a fading industrial city with widespread unemployment, where young people gathered in dark garages, turning distorted guitar feedback into their only way to scream. Mike was swept up in that current. People remember the image of a skinny boy with tangled hair, a bass slung over his back, walking for hours in the rain just to get to a band practice. Not many photos from those years remain. Just a few blurry frames, a shot of a late-night diner, a corner of a bar. We piece together the story from the fragmented accounts of friends through band names that appeared and disappeared. SATO, Gypsy Rose. Each group lasted only a few months, a few gigs before breaking up, but they were sketches, drafts for an inevitable meeting. One friend said that when he first heard Hendrix, Mike stood motionless for an hour, his hand on his bass strings, but not playing a single note. It was as if he realized that to survive in Seattle, he had to play music with the wounds from his own heart. Mike had no plan B. When music lifted him up, he held on tight. When it let go, he didn't know what to cling to. Those 2 tracks kept running, straight towards Seattle. There, someone would put him on a stage, and something else would pull him down. The question is, which one came first? Chapter 2. The Price of Fame. Behind the Stage. In the late 1980s in Seattle, Mike Starr rode a motorcycle, wearing a bathrobe and sunglasses that covered most of his face. It was a strange sight on the rain-slicked streets. Later, Layne Staley recalled, that's exactly the kind of person he wanted in his band. From that moment, Alice in Chains began to take shape. In 1990, the album Facelift was released. At first, it sold only a few copies, but when Man in the Box appeared on MTV, its trajectory changed completely. Gold certification came quickly, pushing grunge into the mainstream for the first time. For Mike, his yearbook dream of gonna tour with Van Halen suddenly came true. Alice in Chains opened for Van Halen themselves. Yet, The stage lights only showed half the story. Backstage was a darker place. A close manager from the Seattle days said the other three were fine. Trouble often followed Mike. No one could predict his next move. On one major tour, a crew member vividly remembers Mike being caught trading tickets and backstage passes right outside the venue. A piece of paper with a hasty signature was kept, like a faded piece of evidence. Some believe he did it for money for drugs. Another crew member, however, said he was just trying to get some quick cash for Layne, who was often struggling with withdrawal. A blurry photo from backstage remains. Mike is standing by the gate, holding a stack of papers, surrounded by a few young people. It's unclear if they are tickets or just a list of fans asking for autographs. But that detail has been passed down as a clue that Mike had crossed a line. In the studio, the contrast was even clearer. An engineer who worked with the band once said that the other three members carefully calculated every expense, while Mike spent money as if they were already superstars. Another remembers Mike often walking into the room with an air of overconfidence, acting as if Alice in Chains was already at the top when they'd only released one album. The story took another turn, too. Some in the industry said Mike often brought strangers backstage, treating it as a privilege. On one occasion, the guest list changed at the last minute, angering the management. No documents remain, just a few scattered accounts. But for the band, Mike was slowly becoming a ticking time bomb. The image of him was fractured because of this. On stage, Mike's bass was the backbone of the band. Off stage, he was seen as a rock star before his time, flamboyant, yet fragile and reckless. These two sides ran parallel, just like the two tracks Mike had been on since his teenage years. One side led him to glory. The other was quietly digging a hole. Was Mike simply self-destructing, or was he covering for a friend's secret? A secret that could have changed the band's fate. Chapter 3. The Buried Song and an Unfixable Crack. In 1992, Alice in Chains went into the studio to make Dirt. They had a successful album, but now it was time to prove they deserved it. The atmosphere in the studio was as taut as a guitar string. Success had just begun, and the pressure had doubled. And Mike Starr was right in the middle of that whirlwind. He brought a song of his own, Fear the Voices. This was his chance to break away from the image of the background bassist and prove himself as a true musician. A studio technician remembers Mike being very confident, believing this would be the track that helped him step out of the shadows of others. But the rest of the band didn't see it that way. The song was deemed unsuitable. Layne tried singing it, but he didn't put his heart into it. According to a crew member, the song was quickly cast aside. It didn't make the main track list for Dirt, only appearing years later, quietly, in the Music Bank box set. For Mike, it was a sign. His contributions were no longer valued. Some say that after the session, Mike angrily left early. A note in the recording schedule still exists. Mike left early. No one knows the specific reason, but from that point on, a clear distance formed within the group. At the same time, public attention began to shift toward Mike. A rock magazine chose him as Sexy Babe of the Month. The photo, blurry in the newspaper, was once taped inside the band's tour bus. Someone on the crew recalled, a band member tore the photo off the board, leaving a jagged edge. Just a few weeks later, tensions erupted. That was the crack. The point of no return came in Brazil in 1993. At a major festival, Mike was rumored to have overdosed on tour. Layne was mentioned as the one who pulled him back. There are no public medical records, only conflicting accounts. After that incident, the crew's patience ran thin. Looking back, some believe Mike didn't leave the band just because of his addiction. He had become a thorn in his bandmates' sides. Fear the Voices was buried. The newspaper photo was torn down, and his presence became a fault line. The fragmented stories create a picture. He was both a troublemaker and a person who was pushed out. Mike saw it differently. Years later, he insisted that he was selling backstage tickets to help Layne through his withdrawals, and that he was kicked out because of that. If that's true, He was punished for trying to save his friend. Where does the truth lie? Was it self-destruction or sacrifice? The remaining clues: a note about leaving early, a torn-down photo, a discarded song, only show us that things inside Alice in Chains were no longer peaceful. Mike lost his place in the band he helped build, and at that very moment, another bond pulled him in. It was his friendship with Layne Staley, a bond that would become the biggest shadow of his life. The question is, when Mike walked out of the studio, carrying a song that would never be released, did he know that his fate was now intertwined with Layne's, in a way no one could have predicted? Chapter 4. The last person to walk out of Layne Staley's apartment. In April of 2002, Seattle was colder and grayer than usual. Layne Staley had withdrawn from the public eye for years. His apartment on the hill became a prison. The curtains were drawn, and light rarely got in. The answering machine's light blinked 0. On the table, a half-eaten box of cold food sat open. Friends said only a few people still visited, and Mike Starr was one of the few. On his birthday, he went to see Layne. According to Mike's account, years later, Layne complained that his body wasn't right. He offered to call 911, but Layne refused and warned that if he did, their friendship would be over. They argued, and according to Mike's account, Layne said, "Don't leave like this." Then he left. Around April the 5th, 2002, according to forensic estimates, Layne died. On April the 19th, 2002, police broke down the apartment door to check on him after his bank account stopped all activity. The statement showed no spending for many days. That was the signal that led his family to request the check. This story, years later, became the center of attention. Mike recounted it on television, on a rehab show. He cried, telling Layne's mother that he should have done something different. She responded with sympathy, but his face remained bowed in guilt. However, many details cast doubt. Some people cross-referenced the timelines and found that the accounts didn't match the records. In the public documents, there is no detail confirming Mike's presence at the scene. Some of Layne's friends said that he barely opened his door to anyone, which makes the question, why was Mike in the apartment that day, difficult to answer definitively. A viewer who rewatched Mike on television remembers him shaking, his eyes filled with anxiety, as if the memory haunted him every night. But others noted that it could be a memory distorted by obsession, or a way for him to seek public redemption. Regardless of the truth, the thread between Mike and Layne, from the day they first met in Seattle, ended in one tragic moment. One person left, the other stayed behind carrying the weight. From here on, Mike's image on television was no longer about telling a story. It was a public confession. Was Mike truly in that apartment on that final day? Or was it just the fragmented memory of a haunted man? And if he was telling the truth, why did he leave, abandoning his friend in the dark? Chapter 5. Confession on camera, redemption or public humiliation. In 2010, a familiar yet distant face suddenly appeared on American television. Mike Starr, with thinning hair and deep-set eyes, sat in a brightly lit room. There was no bass, no stage lights, just a trembling man, looking straight into the camera. He had agreed to appear on Celebrity Rehab, a show that many called a confession on camera. In the episodes, Mike recounted his last day with Layne. He broke down in tears, telling Layne's mother that he should have called for an ambulance. She comforted him, saying her son would have forgiven him. But on his face, forgiveness never seemed to arrive. A crew member from the show remembers Mike often sitting silently for hours, holding a piece of paper with scribbled notes. No one was sure of the contents. Some guessed it was a list of drugs. Others thought it was a message he wanted to send to Layne, a message that was more than 8 years too late. On air, the audience saw a fallen star. Some were sympathetic. Finally, they saw the real person behind the lights. But many of the band's old friends were critical. According to a former associate, they believed the show was just exploiting his pain for entertainment. In one scene, Mike recounted the moment Layne begged him not to call 911. His face was strained, his voice cracking. Many viewers felt it was a real, haunting memory. But a Seattle journalist commented, that scene could also be just a mix of memory and the guilt of obsession, making it hard to distinguish truth from fiction. Behind-the-scenes photos from the show reveal Mike often sat alone, far from the other contestants. The paper cup in front of him remained full. A member of the film crew said he would often whisper to himself, as if talking to someone who wasn't there. So why did Mike agree to appear on the show? One friend said he wanted to make a public amends. Another thought he needed the money. No documents confirmed the true motivation. All we know is that the image broadcast across the nation solidified his role, the last person to see Layne and the one who did nothing. To the public, Mike was no longer just a bassist. He became a symbol of public regret, a character in a national tragedy that everyone watched and discussed. And once he had exposed himself to millions of viewers, he couldn't go back to being a normal person. From here, Mike's journey was no longer a private struggle. It became a public performance where everyone had an opinion, but he alone carried the pain. Did television give Mike a chance for peace, or did it just turn his regret into an even heavier burden? Chapter 6. The Final Days. An unfinished beginning and a quiet death. In early 2011, Mike Starr left Seattle and moved to Salt Lake City. He told friends he wanted to start over. Someone remembers him mentioning a new project with Travis Meeks, the singer of Days of the New. It was a fragile beginning, but he seemed to believe in it. A surviving image from those days. Mike sitting in a small studio, his bass resting on his lap, his eyes tired, but with a slight light in them when he mentioned his new band. No one knows if those recordings still exist. They are only mentioned in a few accounts. But just a few weeks before he died, Mike was pulled over by police in Salt Lake. In the car, they found prescription medication without a prescription. An old warrant was also mentioned in the report. He was taken into custody and then released. A small note in a legal file, but it became evidence that he hadn't escaped his old demons. According to a friend, even after the arrest, Mike was still talking about his hopes of starting over. He called to talk about the songs he hadn't finished writing yet, but his voice was shaky and it broke. He sounded like someone who didn't have much strength left, the friend recalled. On March the 8th, 2011, police received a call to check on the house where Mike was staying. At 1:42 p.m., they entered and found him deceased. There were no signs of foul play. In the report, the cause was listed as drug intoxication. However, some details make everything more ambiguous. There are accounts that Mike had mixed methadone with other painkillers. Others claim he bought a dose of medication from an unknown source. But it all remains just accounts. No public records confirm it. A local reporter wrote, "He passed away in silence, in a city that wasn't his hometown, with unfinished promises." The article ended with a question. Did Mike die from a familiar accident in the opioid crisis, or was there something else hidden in that house that day? Mike's death immediately made many fans think of Layne. Two names forever linked, two deaths separated by 9 years, both marked by drugs and loneliness. From here, the story was no longer private. It became the final part of a double tragedy. Another person from the Seattle rock generation was gone, and the memory of them now only exists through fragmented pieces. In his final days in Salt Lake, did Mike Starr simply succumb to his old habits, or was there a piece of the truth that was lost in the silence? Conclusion: the legacy of a sentence never lifted. Mike Starr, from a boy washing dishes at an IHOP to buy his first bass, to a man who collapsed from drugs in an empty house in Salt Lake. Between those 2 points lies a life full of contradictions. A brief success, behind-the-scenes troubles, a close friendship, and a guilt he couldn't escape. To the public, he isn't remembered much for his bass skills, but for a heavy label, the last person to see Layne Staley alive. Whether it was true or not, that memory became a sentence that followed him for 9 years. Within the band, Mike's name faded, but his legacy remains in every bass note of Facelift and Dirt. Without him, Alice in Chains wouldn't have started their journey. The remaining clues, the discarded song, Fear the Voices, the torn-down photo, the words in the yearbook, all seem like warning signs. But they don't answer the big question. Was Mike self-destructive, or was he pushed out when he tried to save his friend? After he died, the words LS/MS appeared on the band's kick drum. The two initials, Layne Staley and Mike Starr, seemed to be an acknowledgement. They walked side by side, in music and in tragedy. What remains is perhaps a bitter irony. Mike once touched his dream, but his legacy lies in his guilt. People don't ask how he played bass. They ask, what did he do on Layne's last day? The final question still hangs in the air. What did Mike Starr take with him to his grave? A real memory no one would acknowledge, or just a heavy burden he put on himself so he wouldn't have to stand alone?